The sun shone brightly over the city, wrapping the streets in a warm golden glow. It was a beautiful afternoon, one of those days where everything felt calm and peaceful. People walked through the busy sidewalks, chatting, laughing, and enjoying their day. Among them was Clara Tyson, a beautiful young woman, glowing with the warmth of pregnancy. She was carrying new life inside her, a baby that she and her husband, the famous Mike Tyson, already loved deeply. As she walked, she held a brown paper bag close to her body, filled with warm, buttery croissants that she had just bought from the bakery. She could already imagine the delicious taste when she shared them with Mike later. Clara made her way to a park bench, sighing in relief as she sat down. Her belly was big now, and walking too much made her tired. She gently placed a hand on her stomach, feeling a deep love for the little one growing inside her. Suddenly, beneath her palm, she felt a tiny kick. Her baby was awake, full of life. Smiling, she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone to send a quick message to Mike. She wanted to let him know where she was so they could meet up. But before she could even unlock her phone, a loud screech broke the peaceful moment. Tires squealed. A police car came speeding toward the bakery, its wheels skidding loudly as it came to a sudden stop. A chill ran through Clara's body. Even though the sun was shining, she suddenly felt cold. Something about the way the car had stopped, the way the air seemed to grow tense, made her uneasy. The car door swung open and out stepped Officer Logan Mercer. He was a tall, muscular man with a buzz cut and icy blue eyes. He had the kind of face that always looked angry, as if he was never truly happy. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished, but his heart was cold and full of hate. Officer Logan had spent years in power, using his badge not to protect people but to control them. He looked at the world through eyes filled with hate, believing some people didn't belong in certain places. And when he saw Clara Tyson, a rich, confident black woman sitting alone in a nice neighborhood, something inside him boiled with anger. She didn't belong here. Not in his eyes. His face twisted in disgust. Like a predator stalking its prey, he stormed toward her, his boots hitting the ground hard. When he reached the bench, he stopped and barked, "Hey you! Move along. You can't sit here." His voice was sharp and filled with hatred. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Her body tensed as she looked up at him, confused. What had she done wrong? She wasn't bothering anyone. She was simply waiting for her husband. Her hand instinctively moved over her belly, protecting her child from the sudden danger she felt in the air. Still confused, she asked, "Excuse me? I'm just waiting for my husband." Her voice was soft, polite, but firm. She had done nothing wrong and she wouldn't be treated like she had. Officer Logan snorted, crossing his arms. He didn't believe her. In his mind, a woman like her couldn't possibly have a husband who belonged in this part of town. "Your husband?" he mocked, raising an eyebrow. "You people are always looking for handouts?" Clara's blood boiled. "You people." She knew exactly what he meant. Anger twisted inside her, but she kept her voice steady. She wasn't about to let this hateful man bully her. "Sir, I'm not loitering," she said, her voice stronger now. "I just bought something from the bakery. I have every right to sit here." Her words were not just a response, they were a stand. A stand for herself. A stand for her baby. But Officer Logan smirked. He loved seeing people like her get upset. He lived for moments like this, moments where he could make them feel small. "Did I just hear you talk back to me?" he sneered. His hand twitched near his baton, like a snake coiling before a strike. Clara's heart pounded. She couldn't believe this was happening. "I'm not causing any trouble," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm pregnant, for God's sake." Surely that would make him stop. Surely he wouldn't hurt a pregnant woman. But Officer Logan only grinned wider. "Oh, so now you're playing the victim card?" he mocked. His voice dripped with cruelty. And then, without warning, his heavy boot swung out, slamming into Clara's ribs. Crack. The impact sent her flying from the bench. Pain exploded through her body. She hit the ground hard, gasping as she curled around her belly, desperate to protect her baby. Her croissants, those warm, sweet treats she had been so excited to share, spilled onto the sidewalk. They lay there, crushed and broken. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to cry. She refused to give this monster the satisfaction. People around the park froze. Some gasped. Some took out their phones. Some just stared, too shocked to move. Then, one woman couldn't stand still any longer. She ran toward Clara, her feet pounding against the pavement. But before she could reach her, a shadow fell over the park. A storm had arrived. Mike Tyson. He had just turned the corner, expecting to meet his wife and enjoy a quiet afternoon. But instead, he saw red. his pregnant wife on the ground, her arms wrapped around her belly, her face twisted in pain. And standing over her, the man who had hurt her. Something inside Mike snapped. A force greater than rage took over him. His fists clenched. His vision tunneled. He did not see a police officer. He saw a monster. And there was only one thing left to do. Justice. Mike charged forward. Officer Logan turned just in time to see the legend himself rushing toward him. And in the blink of an eye, first met flesh. The first punch was like a lightning strike, sending Saunders staggering backward. The second broke his nose. Blood splattered onto the pavement. Mike didn't stop. His fists flew, each hit a punishment for what this man had done. For Clara. For his unborn child. For every time people like Sanders had abused their power. The officer fell to his knees, gasping, begging for mercy. Mike loomed over him, his fists still trembling with rage. He bent down, his voice low and deadly. If you ever touch my family again? He leaned in closer, his breath hot against the officer's bruised face. I won't stop. Saunders whimpered, nodding frantically. Mike stood up, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched. Then, without another word, he turned to Clara, scooping her into his arms, holding her close, protecting her, because that was what a real man did. Clara fell to her knees, her hands shaking as she reached out toward the hurt woman. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her breath came in short, fast gasps as she tried to speak. Are you okay? She asked, her voice filled with fear but also determination. She wanted to help even though she herself was in pain. The woman, a stranger only moments ago, looked into Clara's eyes. And in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding. They didn't need words. They both knew what had happened was wrong. They both knew the pain of being treated unfairly. Tears spilled from Clara's eyes, running hot down her cheeks. Her whole body hurt, but nothing mattered more than the small life inside her. She placed her hands on her swollen belly, her fingers trembling. Then she felt it, a tiny kick. Her baby was still okay. A shaky breath of relief escaped her lips. But even though she knew her baby was alive, the pain didn't stop. It burned deep inside her, a sharp and gnawing ache that wouldn't go away. She squeezed her belly protectively, as if shielding her unborn child from any more harm. Above her, Officer Logan stood tall, looking down at her with a cruel smile. His eyes were cold and full of something awful, enjoyment. Maybe next time you'll learn some respect, he sneered. His voice was filled with sick delight, like he had just taught a lesson instead of hurting an innocent woman. His boots, covered in dirt, stayed planted on the ground as if they belonged there, just like the darkness inside his heart. The street was silent. No one moved. The bystanders who had seen everything stood frozen in shock. Some had their hands over their mouths. Others held their breath, unsure of what to do. Then, the silence shattered. A loud, piercing sound rang out as a black SUV came speeding down the street. The car's tires screamed against the pavement as it skidded to a stop. The air seemed to grow heavy. The car door flew open. Mike Tyson stepped out. Everything changed in that moment. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. His presence filled the street, a wave of power rolling off of him. The people who had been just standing there, mere spectators, now tensed. Their eyes grew wide with a mix of fear, shock, and excitement. It was like the moment right before a lightning strike. They knew what was about to happen. They could feel it. It was like watching a battle unfold in slow motion, like a fight in an old Roman arena where warriors clashed in front of roaring crowds. Mike Tyson's sharp eyes swept across the scene, taking everything within seconds. His gaze landed first on his wife, Clara. His heart broke. There she was on the ground, her hands clutching her stomach. The woman he loved, the mother of his child, hurt, suffering because of one man's cruelty. Then his eyes locked onto Officer Logan. The man responsible. The man who still had a smirk on his face. But as Mike Tyson stepped forward, something changed. That arrogant smirk began to fade. Officer Logan squared his shoulders, trying to keep his confidence. He puffed out his chest, trying to act like he still had control. Step back, sir, unless you want. He never got to finish his sentence. Mike Tyson moved. It was so fast the human eye could barely track it. One moment he was standing still. The next, boom. His hands had grabbed the officer's collar, lifting him off his feet like he weighed nothing. Gasps rang out through the crowd. Even though they had expected this moment, they still couldn't believe what they had just seen. Mike's body moved like a jungle panther, like a powerful machine built for one thing, justice. His voice was deep, rumbling like a storm rolling in. "You just kicked my wife," he growled, his voice filled with barely controlled rage. His grip tightened around Officer Logan's uniform. The officer's face lost all color. His breath quickened, his body stiff with panic. He tried to speak, but his words failed him. The street was completely silent. Then, crack. Mike Tyson's right hook landed. The sound of knuckles crashing into ribs echoed like thunder. Officer Logan's body flew backward, carried by the sheer power of the punch. The crowd erupted. Some gasped in horror. Some covered their mouths, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. But others cheered. Their voices boomed through the street, clapping and shouting as if they had just watched the villain in a movie finally get what he deserved. Officer Logan hit the ground hard, his breath knocked out of him. He groaned, trying to push himself up. But Mike Tyson wasn't finished. Not yet. With the strength of a lion, he grabbed the officer again, hoisting him to his feet like he was weightless. Their faces were now inches apart. Mike Tyson's voice was low, dangerous. "You like hurting people?" he growled. "How about I show you what pain feels like?" His grip tightened. The officer's hands trembled as he reached for his baton. His last chance at power. His last chance to fight back. But he never got the chance. Mike's left hand shot out, catching his wrist mid-motion. The grip was unbreakable. Officer Logan's eyes filled with terror. Then he did something no one thought possible. He screamed. It was not the scream of a powerful man. It was not the scream of someone in control. It was the scream of a man who had finally lost. The street was still. Mike Tyson stood tall, his fists clenched, his breath heavy. Officer Logan, once full of arrogance, now lay defeated. The people watched, holding their breath. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, from somewhere deep in the crowd, a single clap, then another, and another, until the whole street erupted in applause. The reign of Officer Logan was over. And justice? Justice had finally arrived. As Tyson grabbed the officer's hand, he twisted it with great force. The officer's wrist bent in a way it wasn't supposed to, and he let out a loud cry of pain. His baton, the hard metal stick he used to keep control, slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the ground. The loud clang echoed in the air, and everyone watching knew this officer had lost control. Tyson stood tall, his muscles tight with anger. He wasn't just any man. He was Mike Tyson, the greatest boxer in the world. He had fought many battles in the ring, but this fight was different. This wasn't about fame or money or a championship belt. This was about protecting the most important person in his life, his wife, Clara. Tyson's heart burned with rage. He wasn't just angry, he was furious. His wife was pregnant, carrying their baby, and this man, this officer, had kicked her. The thought made Tyson's fists tighten like two heavy stones. He had felt anger before, but never like this. This was different. This was personal. With the strength of a storm, Tyson threw his fist upward in a powerful uppercut. His knuckles slammed into Officer Logan's stomach like a hammer striking soft clay. The officer, who had once stood tall and proud, instantly lost his balance. His legs shook, his body trembled, and then, like a house of cards, he collapsed. A loud gasp spread through the crowd. People had seen fights before, but never like this. This wasn't a boxing match. This wasn't a sport. This was justice being served with a fist. Officer Logan hit the pavement hard. His breath came in short, painful gasps. He clutched his stomach, his face twisted in agony. He was no longer the strong, fearless man he had been just moments ago. Now he was weak. Now he was the one afraid. Tyson stood over him, his shadow covering the fallen officer like a dark cloud. His voice, usually calm, was now deep and cold. "You don't hit women," Tyson said, his words slow and firm. "You never hit a pregnant woman. And you never touch my wife." Each word was like a punch, cutting deep into the officer's heart. The once powerful man, now reduced to nothing, tried to speak. His voice shook with fear. Please," he stammered. But his words didn't matter. No one cared about his excuses. No one wanted to hear them. Tyson knelt down beside him, his eyes filled with fire. "Begging already?" he scoffed. That didn't take long. The crowd watched in complete silence. Some people cheered loudly, excited by what they had just witnessed. They saw this moment as justice. Justice for every person the officer had ever hurt. Others pulled out their phones, recording everything. They knew this was a moment that people would talk about for a long time. Then, suddenly, W.O. The sound of sirens filled the air. Bright red and blue lights flashed as another police car screeched to a stop. Two officers jumped out, their hands gripping their belts. They had heard the commotion. They had heard the cries. Now they were here to see what had happened. One officer, younger than the other, took a cautious step forward. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew who he was looking at. Mike Tyson. A man strong enough to knock out anyone with a single punch. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. With both hands raised to show he didn't want trouble, he spoke in a careful, respectful voice. "Mr. Tyson," he said. "What happened here?" Tyson turned his head slowly, his gaze sharp as a knife. He lifted a strong, steady finger and pointed right at the beaten officer on the ground. "Your guy kicked my pregnant wife," he said, his voice like thunder. The young officer's face changed instantly. His eyes widened in shock. His back straightened. His hands curled into fists. His whole body stiffened as if disgusted by what he had just heard. For a moment he was silent. Then his face grew hard, his voice cold. "Saunders," he said, turning toward the fallen officer, "you're under arrest." A deep silence spread through the air. Officer Logan, bruised and swollen face twisted in panic. He stuttered, his voice weak. "No. He attacked me." But his lies held no power. The young officer shook his head. He gestured to the crowd, to the dozens of phones still recording. "We have the footage," he said, his voice firm. "And with your history, well, let's just say no one's going to believe your story." Officer Logan's mouth opened, but no words came out. He had no defense. No escape. The young officer pulled out his handcuffs and snapped them onto Saunders' wrists. The once powerful cop was now nothing more than a prisoner. His body, battered and broken, was hauled to his feet. His legs were weak. He could barely stand. As they dragged him toward the police car, he turned his head one last time. His eyes, filled with fear, locked onto Mike Tyson. His lips trembled as if begging for mercy. But Tyson didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't care. Justice had been served. The fight was over, but its impact spread through the streets like waves in the ocean. People whispered. Some still cheered. Some just stood in shock. The world had changed in those few minutes. The powerful officer had fallen. The man who thought he could do anything without consequences had lost. And at the center of it all stood Mike Tyson, unshaken, unmoved, unstoppable. Tyson turned away from the defeated officer and walked toward the person who mattered most, his wife. Clara's body still trembled. She had been scared. She had been hurt. But now she was safe. Tyson's anger melted into something soft and warm. He touched her face gently. "Are you okay, baby?" he asked. Clara leaned into his embrace. The warmth of his arms surrounded her, making her feel safe. Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. "I'm okay," she whispered. "Thanks to you." Tyson bent down and kissed her forehead. Then he placed his strong, protective hand on her belly. He wasn't just a fighter. He wasn't just a champion. He was a husband, a father, a protector. As they turned to walk away, they left behind the wreckage of Officer Logan. He was shoved into the police car, his future no longer in his control. The city, still buzzing from what had happened, would never forget this day. This story would be told again and again. A story of justice. A story of love. A story of a man who protected what was most precious to him. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world, and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.